Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Newcastle United may be on a break, but that doesn't mean that the news stopped. The first thing I want to get into is the Joelinton injury. Obviously, I said on my video before Manchester City, I think, when the news about Joelinton's injury first emerged, that he would be out for about 6 weeks. That was the prognosis that looked like it was the case for Eddie Howe, from Eddie Howe's press conference, and that was obviously a huge blow. He obviously came off with a thigh injury against Sunderland, and it looked pretty innocuous at the time. He actually carried on. He did it in the first half, came through the half time and started. Newcastle took the lead, doubled their lead in that game, and then Joelinton came off. And you know, I've sort of mentioned about Callum Wilson and sort of innocuous injuries. Sort of he would look like he was walking off the pitch fine, and you wouldn't see him for sort of 6 to 8 weeks. And it's kind of the same with Joelinton, but even worse. It was 6 weeks was the initial prognosis. And reports emerged earlier this week that Joelinton was actually going to be out for the rest of the season if he indeed needed surgery on that thigh injury. That looks more and more likely. It hasn't been confirmed by Newcastle, but it does look like he will need surgery and therefore will be out for 4 months, possibly till the end of the season, which is a massive, massive blow when you consider that Sven Botman's already had months out. Harvey Barnes is still out for months. We've only seen Joe Willock once or twice this season so far. And his return date, he has put on Instagram that he's on his way back alongside Matt Targett, who's also been out since October, November time with a hamstring problem. So it's not just, it's been mentioned before, but it's not just the number of injuries and the strain that puts on a squad. It's the type of injuries and the length of these problems. That the amount of time that Newcastle are without these players is becoming such a huge issue, especially someone like Joelinton, because as I said in that video, he sets the tone for that midfield, and he sets the tone, and the midfield sets the tone for the team. So really, he's one of, if not Newcastle's most important player when it comes to their signature intensity and energy and physicality, everything that made them good last season. I think it's no coincidence that Joelinton was such a regular part of that team last season. He played most games, and Newcastle got into the top 4. There's been a real reality check just because of the squad depth. It's easy to get swept up in this sort of thing of Newcastle finishing the top 4. They have to build that. Does that bring the project forward a little bit? I did sort of say at the end of last season on a True Faith podcast that if Newcastle were 8th, 9th this season, that was kind of par for the course. But at the same time, I thought Newcastle did well in the window, and I thought Newcastle's business was good, and they've shown that they are still a top side. So I think that there's a sort of middle ground there in terms of where Newcastle are. They're not, you know, a top 4, top 3. You know, they're not where Villa are now, or where Liverpool are now, or where Manchester City are now. That isn't where they are. But they're also, I don't think they're the 9th or 10th best or 8th best. I think they're a top 6 side, as I alluded to in my last video. And I think they'll get back there. It's just that this injury look has been rotten, and there's a lot of discussion now off the back of that as to whether Newcastle will go further into the transfer window than they originally planned. A midfielder was high on their list anyway. As we know, Calvin Phillips has been linked. Lots and lots of talk about him. And Newcastle not willing to do business with Manchester City at the level that they want. They want 6 to 7 million. I've heard 7. It's been reported as 6 today. In terms of a loan fee, and lots of Premier League clubs have balked at that price. I think Manchester City are going to struggle to offload a 28-year-old midfielder who needs game time for the Euros in the position that they're in, and he's in. I think it's very difficult for them to demand what they're demanding and get away with that, and for teams to come in and pay that. So I wouldn't rule out Calvin Phillips just because I think Manchester City will come down on that price because they have to. But you've also got West Ham and Crystal Palace are also said to be interested. So it's a race on whether Newcastle can sell the deal to Calvin Phillips. I think he would be keen on a move for various different reasons. One, it's in the north, which is still where he lives and his family's based. Obviously, he's from Leeds. And two, they are one of the most exciting clubs at the moment, Newcastle, despite everything. And he would fit in like a glove. He would solve a lot of issues. So it really fits on paper. So I think that Calvin Phillips is a deal to look at. The big question is whether this Joelinton injury really changes anything in terms of Newcastle's desire and intensity in the market. Honestly, I think not. I think they've already kind of looked at it and thought, yeah, we'd like a midfielder, but we're not going to go all out for it. Rightly or wrongly, I don't think Joelinton's injury really makes a difference in terms of how hard they'll go for this January window, because the business really isn't sensible. The benefits of it compared to the summer, where you can recalibrate, you can look more, the market's more open, players are more available. Shopping in January is very, very difficult at the best of times, especially now with the FFP situation, which is hanging over every club, really. I mean, you're seeing it across the Premier League that clubs aren't getting involved because of this FFP situation. So, and what's obviously happened at Everton and happening at Forest as well, and Manchester City and Chelsea have been talked about. Clubs, particularly someone like Newcastle, who are shopping in a different market, as I've mentioned before, to what their real financial standing is. I think they're probably the only club trying to do that. It really makes a big difference in that sense. And I think that Newcastle will. I think they still want a midfielder, and if a deal comes up, they're obviously being linked with Edison from Atalanta just by his profile and the way he plays. I think more likely he's a Bruno Guimaraes contingency plan rather than an option for the January window to come in and complement Bruno and play alongside Bruno. I think that's more of a sense of what could happen in the next few windows, because as I've mentioned before, I don't think Newcastle want to sell any of their key players, but it might come to the point where they have to speed up this FFP process, and there isn't that much value if you look outside of those key players, Bruno, Isak and Botman, as I've mentioned before. The value you're looking for elsewhere, you could look at maybe Jacob Murphy, or take a hit with Sean Longstaff and sell an academy graduate for 100% profit, Miguel Almiron perhaps, but there isn't too much value outside of those three players. So it does look like, it's on the table. And I think this Edison link, if there's anything in it, is more to do with looking at a contingency plan for Bruno rather than a midfield option for this January. So I don't think that Newcastle will be overly busy as a result of this Joelinton injury. And I know that'll be disappointing to some fans. I know that this idea that they need to strengthen to get back into Europe and in the European picture. As I said, I think actually Newcastle are in a strong position if they get players back. We've seen how much, even with those injury problems, how much the likes of Anthony Gordon, Isak and Bruno Guimaraes can carry the team. And when they play well, Newcastle invariably play well. So I think with fixtures coming up that are easing in terms of difficulty after January, an easing schedule and players coming back, I think Newcastle don't necessarily need to dip into the market to really reinvigorate this season. I think they can do that even without Joelinton. That might be optimistic for some people, but I think the club will look at it more like that. So I don't think Newcastle will be making too much more than they would already. I think they still want a midfielder, and I wouldn't be surprised if Calvin Phillips is a Newcastle player by February the 1st. But I don't think the Joelinton injury really changes anything, to be honest. The other thing that I wanted to discuss was Jose Mourinho leaving Roma and his invariable links with Newcastle United, which has been a sort of thing that's hung around ever since the takeover, really, when he was out of work. I think at the time, perhaps he'd just taken over at Roma after leaving Spurs, when Newcastle got taken over in October 2021, and Eddie Howe was brought in. Jose Mourinho was asked about the job then. I think he was at Roma, in fact, and sort of distanced himself from the job, but never hid away from the fact that he loves Newcastle. Obviously, there's Sir Bobby Robson link there. He was Sir Bobby Robson's translator and coach at Barcelona, Sporting Lisbon and FC Porto back in the day. So there's a connection there that he's admitted has made him love Newcastle in a way that perhaps he wouldn't. And a lot of fans obviously think that it'll happen one day and maybe it should happen. I don't think it's going to happen at all. And I think it certainly won't happen anytime soon. He is a manager that you kind of have to take the rough with the smooth with, and that's always been the case, even when he was at Chelsea and Porto and Inter when he was at the top of his game. His personality is very volatile. He rubs people up the wrong way at times, both in and outside of clubs, and it's a bit of a circus. But when he was at his peak, you couldn't argue with what his results were. It was a 3-year cycle of trophy, and it would invariably sort of blow up in his face in the third season. That's how it always was, and then he would leave, and the club would if you look at Chelsea and you look at Inter and Porto, all struggled when he was at his best after that to recover. It's a bit different now, obviously, since he's left Chelsea for a second time. He was sacked with them 16th in the league after winning the league title for them the season before in 2015. And then he went to Manchester United, won the Europa League, but didn't really get them to where they wanted to be, and then got Tottenham to a League Cup final and was sacked the week before. But again, the football that he played at each of those clubs really didn't resonate with the fans, and he stopped being a guarantee of trophies. He wasn't as tactically up to date, I think, is partly the problem. He's very stubborn. His personality is a little bit edgier now than it used to be when he was very charismatic as a younger man 20 years ago. So I think the game has kind of left him behind in truth. And I think really that Mourinho is not the man for Newcastle, who are a very forward-thinking, together club. They play with a lot of energy and intensity on the pitch, which is something that Mourinho's teams just haven't done. I kind of understand his argument that he's made that he isn't a defensive coach, because if you watch his Real Madrid team, that was incredibly great on the counter-attack, and his Chelsea team in 2005 was a very efficient team going forward, despite the fact they had an incredible defensive record as well. So tactically, he doesn't really fit and what Newcastle want to do, because the one thing he hasn't really brought in any of his teams is proactive intensity and energy and pressing. And I think that's what Newcastle are as a club now in pretty much every facet of what they do. They're very, very energetic. They're very, very high octane, and that just isn't what Mourinho brings. But also I think that they are trying to bring a sort of collective approach to what they do as well, and that's not what Mourinho does. Mourinho makes every job about himself, and it just really doesn't fit. And even if Mourinho was at his very best, I would argue that it probably wouldn't fit. But the fact that he's sort of now come out of Roma, obviously, admittedly, he has won the Europa Conference League, got them to the Europa League final. He has worked his magic to a degree, but it still ended in the sort of negative way that's always been the case of his career. And he leaves burning buildings if he doesn't, either by being sacked or by walking away into another job. It's not a job that he's done which really makes me think that he's perfect for Newcastle. I just think this is a very romantic idea because of the Bobby Robson thing. Maybe if this takeover happened 5 or 6 years ago, this would have been on the cards, but absolutely not now. And also, you got to add into the fact that he's already talking openly about managing in Saudi Arabia. And I think if you're a manager who's got the tactical development that he's got, which is I think where the game's kind of left him behind, and you're already talking about managing in Saudi Arabia, then the writing's kind of on the wall. So Mourinho, I really don't think, even if Eddie Howe's under pressure, which we've discussed on this channel before, I'm not convinced he is, but even if he were to be under pressure, I don't think Mourinho would be on the list of potential replacements. This is just a non-starter. It's just romanticised, it's just speculation, and it won't happen. Thank you very much for joining me. If you like this content, please continue to like, share and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.